Hello and welcome back to Now Read This with Shazam Watkins here. Today we are going to be reviewing Fire and Blood by George R.R. Martin. So I have been long awaiting this book. I am a huge George R.R. Martin fan and Game of Thrones fan, A Song of Ice and Fire in general, and I really enjoy history. And I really enjoy fantasy history as well. So one of my favorite, this book, number one, just came out. It came out, I think, 4 days ago, maybe, something like that. So I've spent those 4 days going through this book in depth, and then also the audiobook, because I'm a huge fan of RIOT'z's work on the first 5 books in the Game of Thrones, or A Song of Ice and Fire series. So this is a unique book because it's one of the first we've been waiting so long for George to release, The Winds of Winter, which is frustrating me, and I think it's frustrating a lot of people, just based on, why can he get 2 history books out of his story? Why the backstories when you can't just write what's happening next in the story? I would say that in many ways, I almost feel like George having to go back and do these kinds of books is almost his way of trying to find out how to progress forward. I don't know if that's true. I have a lot of different theories about Mr. Martin's kind of I don't know, his process is weird, but I understand the need to look backwards in order to see forwards, which kind of brings me to the history thing. I love history, and I read a lot of it. One of my favorite historians is John Julius Norwick, and he wrote a 3-part series on Byzantium, but he's also written he wrote recently, I read one of his last books, which was A History of France, and it was 2,000 years in a book about this size. So, kind of mashed together almost. So there's a few things I would say. Fire and Blood, number 1, is kind of like John Julius Norwick's trilogy on Byzantium, whereas he wrote a smashed together version, which was a brief history of Byzantium. So this book is sort of, I think, George R.R. Martin's process and desire and attempt to bring the conquest from Aegon the First and the rest of the Targaryen kings up to the Mad King into kind of a wide history. So it's 700 pages. I thought that this was going to be an overarching way of laying out the Targaryen the Targaryen kings and queens and rules through the 7 kingdoms. But this is only half, I believe, not even half of what's happening, because you start with the conquest of Aegon the First, and you end with the ascension of Aegon the Third, which that's not even half of the kings of Westeros, with the Targaryen kings anyway. But it is genius. I think it's amazing, and once again, you are reading from the perspective. Let's see, I can't remember. Being a history of the Targaryen kings of Westeros, it says transcribed by George R.R. Martin, and it's by Archmaester Gildane of the Citadel of Oldtown. So once again, set into the style of actually the world of Ice and Fire, and honestly, I don't know which of the two I'm more into. So a lot of people have been saying that what's in Fire and Blood is kind of just a rehashing of what's in the world of Ice and Fire, but I would say that's sort of a closed-minded perspective. Although I would say the world of Ice and Fire I found a lot more interesting because it went back beyond the Targaryen conquest, and what I was really hoping to see from Fire and Blood, which was not confirmed or really talked about, was I wanted to see more of what was happening in Valyria before the fall. And none of that is touched on. I mean, there's a couple things that are hinted at that are really interesting, but it doesn't really go into that. And I'm not, a Game of Thrones historian by any means. And there's many more people on YouTube, especially, that have theories and go into details. So I'm sure that whatever they're finding in this book is probably more significant. But some things that you do find are interesting is, one thing that really stuck out to me was Daenerys has 3 dragon eggs, and you pretty much find out where those 3 eggs came from, which is great. It's awesome to kind of be able to piece these details together. Once again, also you're reading from the Wise Fool Mushrooms history, which I think was drawn on in the world of Ice and Fire as well. So it's a fake history, it's a fictional history, but it's really funny. I love the fact that one of the most reliable sources on the Targaryen kings is a fool, or a jester, a court jester. So yeah, I would say Fire and Blood is sort of a drawn-out, detailed, very, very detailed extrapolation on the Targaryen rule within Westeros. So you don't, unfortunately, get anything about Valyria, really. There's just a few things that are hinted at. Number one being a princess, one of the princesses of the Targaryens rode off with Balerion the Black Dread, and it's theorized that she may have gone to Valyria, and when she returned, one of the maesters that were treating her wounds kind of theorized that they probably went to Valyria because of the hideous affliction that the princess was experiencing. So yeah, you get a huge detail that's a political laying out in many ways. It's not very exciting in terms of, there's not a lot of action or first person things, but you do get dialogue, and you do get many characters that have been talked about throughout A Song of Ice and Fire. You get to you get more of an insight into who they were, what their motives were, and you at least get to kind of see, like, sometimes I'm thinking about the Baratheons. It seems like the Baratheon overthrow of the Targaryens was long in coming. It was something that I feel like was almost seeded early on. I love, obviously, hearing about Dorne and the Dornish Wars, which were, you get a lot more of that. It seems like in this book you got a lot more of Dorne and the early kingships than you did of the later ones, and it kind of just fast forwarded everything, and so you do get more of a perspective on who was riding the dragons, the fact that dragons didn't just have one rider. You have multiple Targaryen kings and queens and princesses and princes riding these different dragons, but the two main things that are focused on in Fire and Blood that take up the majority of this new book are the reign of Jaehaerys, the Conciliator, or the Old King, who is said to have taken, from Aegon, conquering Westeros, but he really, Jaehaerys, the Conciliator, made the 7 kingdoms into one kingdom. I thought learning more about Jaehaerys was really, really cool. He's not spoken of at great length. It's not like he's not a legendary king from what we've all read before in many ways, and in this one it just really goes to show you how much he had to do, how much he accomplished against all of these odds, and then his children really starting a civil war that became known as the Dance of Dragons. Not the Dance with Dragons, but the Dance of the Dragons, which was, virtually a civil war between Valyrians and Targaryens, and over the ascension of the rightful heir to the throne, and the rightful heir to the throne being a queen, and then Westeros really, preferring the ascension of a king because the male line of succession was considered stronger. So you do get a lot of Jaehaerys, and you do get a lot of what was happening in the Dance with the Dragons, and you end at the ascension of Aegon III. I don't know much about Aegon III yet, because the book really ends just as he takes the rule. He before he was actually ascended to the throne, the kingdom was ruled by regents. But you do get to you get to hear more about the North a little bit as well. One of the queens visiting the wall, and I think it was, it's been hinted at that she declared it super important that the upkeep of the wall, and had a lot of respect for the Night's Watch. And the relationship between the Targaryens and the Northmen is pretty interesting. I always love to hear more about that. So, Yeah, I mean, it's a lot to get through. It's 700 pages, like I said, 706 or 708 or so. But mostly it's just dealing with Targaryens. So in many ways, it's been put forward as the Silmarillion. The GRR Marillion is what some people are calling it. But I would say that the Silmarillion is far more like the World of Ice and Fire. I would not say that Fire and Blood is anywhere close to the Silmarillion. I think that the Silmarillion has a lot more legend, has a lot more quality of question than it does have answer, and it goes from the creation of things. And it doesn't just talk about the elves and the elven kingdoms or whatever the Targaryens can be, compared to. It talks about where the Númenóreans came from, and the kingdom of Gondor and Arnor and all those things. I'm a huge Tolkien nerd, and the Silmarillion is actually my favorite book Tolkien ever wrote, albeit released posthumously. But yeah, I would say that the World of Ice and Fire is far more like the Silmarillion, and the World of Ice and Fire is, I think it's more interesting because you get so much of the map that George has laid out for us. One of the tragedies of his writing is going to be that you don't get to hear more about Yeti and Sithorius and Ashai and all of these. I mean, more than half of the entire world map of the Song of Ice and Fire, a Song of Ice and Fire, I guess, legendarium. You don't get to hear more about that, and so I feel like it is a little bit redundant to just put out two massive tomes about the Targaryen king's rule. Even though it's interesting, it's just one dynasty, and there's so much more within the world that you want to hear about and you want to know about. And so I would give this a good four stars, because it's been fascinating to know more about the Targaryens, but I don't want to hear more about the Targaryens in many ways. I want to hear more about the reptile men and the men of Ib and the kingdom of Yeti and how Ashai came about and all of those things like that. So if you really want to know a detailed accounting of the Targaryen rule, which I think is pretty essential if you really want to delve into the lore of A Song of Ice and Fire, I would absolutely recommend this book. And it was great. I enjoyed it. His writing is fantastic. It's not quite as creative as his actual books are, or the actual books in the series, the 5 books, A Dance with Dragons and A Game of Thrones and all of those. But it is written in a very cool style. It's a historian style, and it does again remind me of John Julius Norwick, who I would strongly suggest you read from his perspective as well. Just history. So it's a historian. It's a history book, and it has a lot of. I feel like it gives you a lot of answers that are more factual and more hashed out, whereas we've all had so many questions. I think this wraps up a lot of the questions that we had about the Targaryen kings, but it doesn't give us anything about Old Valyria, which is something that I'm a little bit sad about. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. I think that there was probably more I wanted to say, but I think that wraps it up. I would totally suggest you get it. I don't know if you'll like it more than you'll like The World of Ice and Fire. It just depends on if you want a more detailed extrapolation or if you want a less detailed one. And if you want more about, the fantastical elements of this world. Because this one, it has a lot about the dragons, and it has a lot about the kings and the details and the political maneuvering and posturing, and that's cool. But, this is a fantasy world, and fantasy has to do with magic and swords and dragons and all this other stuff. So, I don't know if you'll like it, but I loved it. And anybody that's a huge fan of George is going to like it. Another part of this review that I will have to mention is that this is the first book that is recorded as an audiobook that is not read by the great, wonderful, and late Roy Dotrice. Roy Dotrice broke the Guinness Book of World Records for voicing, I think he broke it 3 or 4 times for voicing individual characters within A Song of Ice and Fire in the first 5 books. And also he read The World of Ice and Fire as well. Roy Dotrice, I think, is my favorite narrator
pretty much of all time now. And he really didn't read that many different things. I love audiobooks, I love narrators, and I love accents and voices and things like that. So you can't really beat RIOT'z, and especially it's the thing that you grew to love listening to the books for. So, you know, it's like you can't beat that. But George did, or whoever, I don't know, they hired a man named Simon Vance, who I'm a huge fan. A huge fan of Simon Vance. Simon Vance just read Alan Moore's Jerusalem, which was a 60-hour audiobook. And if you've read the book or listened to it, you'll understand how difficult it must have been to really communicate all of the wonderful themes and voices in that, and the disturbing themes and elements in that book, in Jerusalem. So Simon Vance reads this book, and he does a fantastic job. The only thing that I'm iffy about is if Simon Vance if they will hire him to do the next two books, The Winds of Winter and A Dream of Spring. And if he is able to satisfactorily voice that many characters. The only thing that I would critique Simon Vance on, and this isn't a negative thing, this is just a different style. RIOT'z, when he is voicing characters, you can really not tell it's RIOT'z. There's a few that obviously he can't do females in a genuinely feminine way. But the way he does Tyrion, the way he does Yoren, the way he does Robert, the way he does the Pyromancer, it's like you don't even think about it being the same guy reading the book to you. It is seriously like he channeled all of these people. RIOT'z is a masterful voice actor. I'm just going to say that. Probably the best I've ever heard. Simon Vance read this one in much the same style as Martin Shaw read The Silmarillion, and it's great, and I love it, and it's kind of it's like a speech, you know. He's just given it, and that's how it is. But Simon Vance is a great voice actor, but you can always tell it's Simon Vance. So, in my opinion, I don't know if Simon Vance is the right guy to read the next two books in A Song of Ice and Fire. However, I will say bravo, amazing job, and great choice in narrator for the next thing, especially because we didn't want to be disappointed without RIOT'z, who unfortunately passed away, which is why he's not reading the books. Anyway, much love. Sorry about that.
So, thank you for joining me on Now Read This. I do these book reviews every Wednesday and Friday, and I do my own audiobooks on Monday. Thank you for joining me. Please like and subscribe if you feel so inclined, and click the little bell thingy, ring the bell button, and please share this video and comment, and email me at readwithshazam@gmail.com if you want to give me any if you have any questions, or if you have any suggestions or anything like that. Feel free to send me a book or send me your music. I would love to review either of those things, and I really hope that you enjoy Fire and Blood on our Black Friday edition. Thank you so much for joining me. Farewell, much love, goodbye.